The night Harlow Veck walked into Beckett's office without knocking. She wasn't trying to get fired. She was trying to return a flash drive before he noticed it was missing. She'd had it for 11 days. Long enough to copy nothing, read everything, and wish she hadn't. Beckett didn't look up from the papers on his desk when the door opened. He had that kind of stillness, the sort that made you aware of your own heartbeat, the shuffle of your shoes on marble, the way your lungs forgot their rhythm when the air in a room changed. "You're late," he said. "I'm always late." She set the drive on the corner of his desk. "I found that in the copier room." He looked at it, then at her. He had grey eyes, not the soft kind, the kind that had been grey a long time, the colour of something that used to be blue before too many winters got to it. When? 2 weeks ago. The silence that followed was the particular kind that cost something. "Sit down, Harlow." She didn't. She stood with her hands loose at her sides the way she'd learned to stand in rooms where sitting down was a form of surrender. She'd grown up in a house where her mother stood like that at the kitchen sink. Never sat, never stayed, never gave anything the chance to feel permanent. Harlow had inherited the posture, if not the reasons for it. Beckett leaned back in his chair. The desk between them was the size of a dining table and twice as cold. "You read it," he said, not a question. "Parts of it, and I put it back." He picked up the drive, turned it over once, set it in his drawer and closed it the way a man closes something he's already decided about. "You could have handed it to Mercer downstairs. That's protocol." "Mercer's been skimming from the shipping accounts for 8 months. I didn't think he needed more material." Something shifted behind Beckett's eyes. Not surprise. He didn't do surprise, at least not where she could see it. More like recalibration. "How long have you known about Mercer?" "Since March. I flagged it in the Q1 reconciliation." Nobody responded. "In writing, to your operations director. I have the timestamp." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the city did what cities do at 11 at night, hummed, complained, moved without going anywhere. Harlow's studio was 40 minutes by bus in a direction no one with money ever needed to travel. She had a rent check due in 4 days and $27 in her account. "Sit down," Beckett said again. This time she did. She had taken the job at Beckett Holdings the way you take most things when you're 29, with a 2-year gap in your resume and a reference list that required explanation, carefully, without asking too many questions. The gap was her mother's illness. The explanation was that she'd been a full-time caregiver, and then, suddenly, wasn't. After the funeral, she'd come back to a city that had rearranged itself in her absence, found her apartment sublet and her savings halved, and spent 6 months doing temp work in downtown offices that smelled of microwaved lunches and ambient disappointment. Beckett Holdings had advertised for a financial analyst with discretion and numerical precision. The discretion part should have been a warning sign. She'd taken it as a compliment. The work was clean, in the sense that the numbers were clean. What the numbers represented was a question she'd gotten comfortable not asking. She balanced accounts. She flagged anomalies. She built spreadsheets so precise they hummed. Beckett's operation was large enough that a person could work in it for years and never need to understand what it was built on. Harlow had needed exactly 7 months. The flash drive had been sitting in the copier tray on a Tuesday afternoon. She'd picked it up thinking it was hers, plugged it in at her desk out of habit, spent the next 4 hours reading documents she was never supposed to see. She hadn't taken it to Beckett right away because she'd been afraid. She hadn't destroyed it because she was more afraid of what she'd do if she had nothing to hold. She'd given it back because, in the end, she was tired of holding things. The first time Beckett came to her apartment, it was a Wednesday. She wasn't expecting him. No one who lived where she lived expected men like Beckett to come through the door. The building was the kind that smelled of old carpet and people working too hard, where the elevator worked 3 days out of 5, and the intercom crackled like a dying radio. She'd been at her kitchen table with a bowl of soup going cold, and her laptop open to the Q3 reports he'd given her access to after the flash drive conversation. She'd been cross-referencing figures for 2 hours. Her left knee was pressed against the table leg to stop it from wobbling. The knock came at 7:43. She knew it was him before she opened the door. She didn't know how she knew. Something in the quality of the knock, the way it landed flat and deliberate without apology. She still checked the peephole. She still felt the bottom drop out of her stomach. She opened the door with the chain on. "How did you get my address?" she said. "I employ you," Beckett said. "I have your address. That's not the same thing as having permission to use it." He looked at her through the gap. He was in a dark coat, no tie, the collar of a grey shirt visible at the base of his throat. He looked like he was a man who didn't drive himself places, who'd been driven here and left his driver somewhere out of sight, because he didn't want a witness. "There's a problem with the Aldgate accounts," he said. "You couldn't have called." "I did. You didn't answer." She thought about the 2 calls she'd let go to voicemail while she was in the shower. "It's 7:45. I'm aware of the time." She unhooked the chain. Not because she wasn't angry about it, she was. She unhooked it because the Aldgate accounts were one of the things she'd been quietly worried about for 3 weeks, and she wanted to know which part he'd found. He came inside like he'd been in worse places and not needed to say so. Stood in her kitchen doorway and looked at the table. The laptop, the soup, the stack of printed pages held together with a binder clip that had bent slightly from being opened and closed too many times. "You printed these," he said. "I think better on paper. That's a security risk. So is letting your operations director ignore 8 months of documented theft." She pulled out the second chair. "Sit down or leave, Beckett. I'm not standing in my own kitchen." He sat. For the next 2 hours, they worked through the Aldgate discrepancy. It was a transfer irregularity. Not as crude as what Mercer had been doing, more layered, the kind of thing that looked like rounding errors until you put 6 quarters side by side and realized they were all facing the wrong direction. Beckett didn't speak much. Neither did she. He had a way of reading numbers that was different from most executives she'd worked for. He didn't skim, didn't delegate the understanding, didn't wait for her to summarize. He sat with the data until it told him something. She hadn't expected that. At 9:50 he said, "Where did you learn to do this?" "Do what?" "See patterns. My mother taught me to keep accounts." She closed the laptop. She ran a laundromat. 15 machines, 4 employees, 2 suppliers who liked to be creative with invoices. "I balanced her books from the time I was 14. "And the gap in your resume?" She looked at him. She got sick. He nodded once. Not with pity. She would have thrown him out for pity. With the kind of acknowledgement that didn't require decoration. He stood to leave. At the door he paused, and she noticed for the first time that his left hand, the one he'd been resting on her kitchen table for 2 hours, had a scar that ran from the base of his thumb to the inside of his wrist. Old. Silvered. The kind that didn't come from an accident. She didn't ask. "Lock the door," he said. "I was going to," she said. The night everything went wrong was a Thursday 3 weeks later. She'd been pulling a late one. Not unusual. She'd been working late most nights, since the Aldgate situation opened into something larger and more complicated than either of them had anticipated. Someone inside the organization was moving money with enough sophistication to look legitimate from 3 angles simultaneously. It required her to approach it from a 4th. She'd taken the files home because Beckett's office was being renovated on the east side, and the noise made it impossible to concentrate. She'd had permission to bring them. She'd had a bag she always kept locked. She'd had, until somewhere between the office and the bus stop, a grip on what she was doing. She hadn't noticed the man following her until she was half a block from her building. She'd noticed on the stairs that her bag felt wrong. Not lighter, wrong. She'd gone to her apartment, locked the door, sat on the bathroom floor between the tub and the toilet with the bag in her lap and shaking hands, trying to figure out what had been taken and what had been put back and what any of it meant. She'd been there 40 minutes when the knock came. She hadn't answered it. The knock came again, harder. Then Beckett's voice, low and flat through the door. "Harlow, open it." She got to the door. She was still shaking, which she hated. She was still in her work clothes, which were damp because she'd been sweating, and the bathroom was cold and she hadn't moved for 40 minutes. She opened the door, and he was there in the hallway with 2 men behind him and an expression on his face that she couldn't read at all. "The bag," he said. "Someone went through it." Her voice came out steady. She'd always been able to make her voice steady even when the rest of her wasn't. "On the bus, maybe, or the stop. I didn't feel it. Are you hurt?" "No, they didn't touch me." He stepped inside without being asked. His 2 men stayed in the hall. He took the bag from her, not roughly, not gently, just with the efficiency of someone who needed information and knew how to move toward it, and went through it himself. Methodical, thorough. 2 pages, he said. "Not the ones you'd think. I know which ones." She sat on the kitchen table edge because her legs were tired, and she didn't care anymore about performing composure. They took the Veckman routing records and the February transit logs. They left the Aldgate files, because they already have the Aldgate files. She'd suspected that. Hearing it said out loud was a different thing. "This is about the routing," she said. "Someone's been watching long enough to know which pieces they needed. Yes, that means they're inside. Yes." She looked at him. He was standing by her window, not looking out, just standing, the way he sometimes stood in the middle of conversations, as if he needed to locate himself in the room. There was a cut along his jawline she hadn't noticed before, fresh, a 1/4 inch below his ear. He'd come from somewhere before he'd come here. "Were you followed tonight?" she said. "No, but you knew they'd come for me. I suspected it. I came when I was certain. What's the difference between suspecting and being certain?" 20 minutes, he said. "I'm sorry for the 20 minutes. She didn't know what to do with that. He wasn't a man who apologized. She'd worked for him for nearly a year, and she'd never heard him apologize to anyone for anything. "Sit down," she said. "You're bleeding." He touched his jaw, looked at his fingers. "It's minor." Beckett. She went to the cabinet under the sink where she kept a first aid kit that had come with the apartment, and which she'd been slowly adding to since her mother's years of hospitalizations had taught her that medical supplies were never where you needed them. "Sit down." He sat at the kitchen table. She stood in front of him and cleaned the cut with an antiseptic wipe, while he looked at some neutral point past her shoulder and said nothing, which was what Beckett did when he was in pain and didn't want it to be a discussion. She worked in silence. Up close she could see the other scars. Not the one on his hand, which she'd catalogued already, but the ones at his collar and the one that curved behind his left ear, and the general topography of a face that had been restructured, not all at once, but incrementally over years, by encounters that had left their marks. "There are 3 people inside my organization who have access to the Veckman routing," he said, while she was pressing a bandage to his jaw. "I know. I built the access architecture, which means you know who I'm talking about." "I do. Tell me, Lenora from Treasury, your brother, and whoever signed off on the February audit." She stepped back. "I couldn't get a name on the audit sign-off. It went through a shell." He looked at her then, actually looked at her, not past her or through her, but at her, the way he rarely did in the office. "How long have you known about my brother?" he said. 8 weeks. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I wasn't sure what you'd do. You thought I'd protect him." "I thought you might," she said. "Or I thought you'd react before I had documentation." Either one of those would have been worse than waiting. He was quiet. She could hear the building's pipes doing their nightly complaint, the distant sound of someone's television through the floor above. "And now," he said, "now I have documentation." She went to the laptop on the table. It had been open this whole time, the screen dimmed to save power. She pulled up the file, turned it to face him. 11 weeks of transfers, each one under the threshold that triggers automated review, routed through 4 shells, 2 of which trace back to a holding company registered to a name that doesn't match any person who actually exists, which is clean work, by the way, professional. But the sequence pattern is identifiable because it's the same person making the same decision at the same time of month. First, Tuesday, every month, 8 months. He looked at the screen for a long time. "First Tuesday," he said. "Same day as your board meetings when you're guaranteed to be occupied." Another silence. This one had a different quality than the earlier ones, heavier, the kind that settles when something that was theoretical becomes a fact you have to live with. "His name is Callum," Beckett said. "My brother. I know. He's been with me for 6 years. I know." She sat down across from him because this was the part where she stopped being the analyst and became something she hadn't signed up to be. She'd known it would come. She'd put it off as long as she could. "What do you want to do with it?" she said. He looked up from the screen. "What do you want to do with it?" he repeated, like he was checking whether he'd heard her correctly. "I work for you. You make the call. I need to know which direction we're going before I decide what else to document. Most people wouldn't ask me that. Most people who work for you don't know what I know." He sat back. He had a way of being still that wasn't passive, more like compression, like something held under pressure. She'd noticed it the first time they'd sat across this table. She'd thought then that it was a performance. She'd stopped thinking that sometime in the last 3 weeks. "You're not afraid of me," he said. "I'm afraid of plenty of things. Not of me." She thought about how to answer that, honestly, without it becoming something else. "I'm afraid of what you could do if you decided to." "I'm not afraid of what you will do. There's a difference." "How do you know what I'll do?" "I don't, but you've had 8 weeks to find out I knew about your brother and do something about it." She met his eyes. "You came here tonight to make sure I was safe, so." The silence that came after that was the longest one yet. She let it sit. She'd learned that from him, actually, the patience to let silence be a room you stayed in, instead of a gap you rushed to fill. Outside it had started to rain. She could hear it on the window ledge, the uneven percussion of a city reluctantly agreeing to water. "There's a woman," Beckett said. "I've been—" He paused, chose a word and discarded it. "There are expectations, her family, business considerations." He looked at the table. "I told her last week." "Told her what?" "That I was reconsidering." Harlow was careful to keep her face still. She'd gotten good at that. "Because of the investigation, partly. What's the other part?" He didn't answer that. Instead, he stood, buttoned his coat, and looked out her window at the street where his car was presumably idling. The cut on his jaw was small under the bandage. He looked, standing there in her kitchen at midnight, like a man who had made several calculations and was still not sure he'd gotten the answer right. "I need you somewhere safe until this is resolved," he said. "I'm fine here. Harlow." "Beckett," she stood too. "I've been keeping myself safe in apartments like this one for 6 years. I'm not going to a safe house. I wasn't suggesting a safe house." She understood what he was suggesting. It landed somewhere in her chest, warm and alarming in equal measure. "That's a worse idea," she said. "I know. It complicates everything. I know. You haven't even—" She stopped, started again. "You're doing this because of Callum, because you feel like you owe me for staying quiet, for not using what I had against you." "No," he said. "Just that. No." She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back. He was very bad at saying things out loud. She'd noticed that. He was precise in writing, precise with numbers, precise in consequence. But in rooms like this one, at midnight, with rain on the windows, he got quiet in a way that meant more than most people's eloquence. "I'll think about it," she said. "That's more than I expected." She walked him to the door. His men straightened in the hallway when they heard it open. "Beckett," she said. He turned. "Your brother." She kept her voice even. "Whatever you decide, document your decision. In writing. Before you do anything." She held his gaze. "So there's a record of who you were when you made it." He was quiet for a moment. Something moved across his face that she didn't have a name for yet. "All right," he said. She locked the door after him. She stood in her kitchen for a long time looking at the laptop, the soup she'd never finished, the chair he'd sat in. The bandage wrapper was still on the counter. She picked it up, folded it precisely, threw it away. Then she sat back down and kept working. She moved the files to the estate on a Saturday, in a bag that fit in the overhead compartment of the car that came to get her without fanfare. No announcement, no ceremony, just a number she'd been given and a time and a black car at the curb outside her building. The estate was north of the city, the kind of property that had been built with the intention of being permanent, surrounded by trees that were older than the building, and a driveway long enough to forget the road behind you. She was given a room on the second floor with a desk and a window that looked over the back garden. The desk was solid oak, which she mentioned to no one, but she noted it the way she noted things that mattered, quietly, with the understanding that she'd probably been right to notice. The first 3 days she barely saw Beckett. He was managing the Callum situation through intermediaries, and she was doing the thing she was best at, building a case so airtight that a decision made inside it could survive scrutiny from any direction. She worked 12 hours a day and slept badly and ate what was left in the kitchen after everyone else was done with it. On the 4th day, she came downstairs at 6 in the morning and found him already at the table in the kitchen with coffee and a phone he wasn't looking at. She got her own coffee, sat across from him. "Callum," she said. "He knows we know. He's deciding whether to run or negotiate. What do you want him to do?" Beckett looked at his coffee. "I want him to have not done it," he said. "But that's not a current option." "No." She was quiet for a moment. Did he need the money? No. Then it was about something else. "Control," Beckett said. He wanted to be able to leave if he wanted to leave. He wanted the option. He paused. "I understand it." She looked at him. "I'm not forgiving it," he said. "I understand it." "There's a difference," she said. He looked up, almost something close to wry. "You've said that to me before. It keeps being true." They drank their coffee. Outside the garden was grey and wet, and the trees were doing what trees do in autumn, which is let go of things without making it mean too much. "The woman," Harlow said. "You're Rowan." "Her name is Rowan." She noticed he'd answered before she could frame the question. "Is it settled?" "Yes." He turned his coffee cup once on the table. "I should have settled it earlier. It wasn't fair to her. She's angry." "Yes, that's fair. Her family will manage," he said. "They always do. People with enough money always do." She nodded. She didn't say anything about what it meant that he'd ended it, about the timing, about the fact that he'd ended it before the Callum situation resolved, which meant it wasn't about optics or liability. She didn't say any of that. She filed it in the same place she filed the scar on his hand and the 20-minute apology, and the way he'd looked at her across the table in her kitchen when he thought she wasn't paying full attention. She'd been paying full attention. "I want to finish the Aldgate documentation before we move on Callum," she said. "If we close the Aldgate thread first, he loses the leverage he might think he has. The second thread becomes cleaner." "How long?" "End of week." He nodded. End of week. She stood, took her coffee, and went back upstairs to her desk by the window and the garden that was going grey and quiet. She worked until noon without stopping. At some point around 10, she became aware that a second cup of coffee had appeared at the edge of her desk. She hadn't heard anyone come in. She didn't look up to find out who'd left it. She wrapped both hands around it and kept working. The Aldgate case closed on a Friday. Callum called the following Monday. She wasn't in the room for the call, but she heard the quality of the silence afterward, the particular texture of air when a decision has finally been made, and the making of it is already in the past. Beckett came to find her in the study. He stood in the doorway. She was at the desk, adding a final notation to the summary file, the one that would eventually go to legal, and then further than legal, into systems and processes she didn't track. "It's done," he said. "I know." She saved the file, closed the laptop. "He's not," he stopped. "He's not going to prison, but he's out. Everything he built here." Walked back. She nodded. She understood what that cost and didn't make it cost more by commenting on it. "You can go back to your apartment," he said, "if you want." The apartment. The table with the wobble. The elevator that worked 3 out of 5 days. The bus at 40 minutes in one direction. The city that had rearranged itself while she was looking after her mother and hadn't quite rearranged back. "Is that what you want?" she said. Beckett looked at her from the doorway. He was still bad at rooms like this one, with feelings in them, with questions that didn't have numerical answers. But he'd gotten slightly better over the last 2 weeks, or she'd gotten better at reading what bad looked like on him, which might amount to the same thing. "No," he said. "Just that." She leaned back in her chair. "I want a proper contract, renegotiated, with a title that matches what I actually do done, and I want the key to the study. not a temporary code. An actual key, also done. And if anyone in this organization ever again ignores a written flag I submit through proper channels, I want to hear about it directly. From you, same day. Done. His mouth shifted, not quite a smile, but adjacent to one, the way certain numbers are adjacent to a solution. Is that everything? She thought now, she said. He came into the room. Not the full distance, just enough. Enough for it to mean something without being required to say what it meant. Outside, the garden was still grey, but the rain had stopped and there was a particular quality to the light that happened sometimes in the late afternoon of a turning season, when the sky couldn't quite decide whether to give in to dark. Harlow turned to the window and looked at it. After a moment, Beckett came to stand beside her. They didn't say anything. They didn't need to.